The air was heavy that evening, the kind of weight you could feel pressing down as the sun dipped below the horizon. Downtown Ridgefield wasn't the sort of place you'd call dangerous, but it wasn't peaceful either, especially not when the wrong people were around. It was the kind of neighborhood where staring too long at someone could earn you trouble, and tonight was no exception. At a corner convenience store under flickering neon lights, a woman stood by the shelves, scanning the aisle for her favorite energy drink. She wasn't looking for trouble, never was, but trouble had a way of finding her. Her name was Kayla. To anyone who didn't know her, she looked like any other 30-something. Toned build, confident posture, and calm eyes that didn't flinch easily. She was dressed casually, hoodie, jeans, sneakers, blending in like any other customer. But her movements, quick and precise, spoke of someone who was always aware, always calculating. As Kayla grabbed a drink from the shelf and walked to the cashier, she heard it. The sound of snickering from the other end of the store. Her instincts, finely tuned from years of grueling training, told her she was being watched. She glanced over, pretending not to notice as three men leaned against the slushy machine, eyes locked on her. Their whispers were low, but their intent was loud. The tallest of them, a man with tattoos crawling up his neck and a crooked grin, nudged his friend with his elbow. "Look at her," he muttered, voice carrying just enough for her to hear. "Bet she thinks she's better than us." Kayla kept walking, ignoring it. She wasn't here for a fight. All she wanted was to pay, leave, and get home. But as she reached the cashier, her gut told her this wouldn't end quietly. The man with the tattoo stepped away from his group, strolling over with the kind of swagger that screamed trouble. "You deaf lady," he said, standing a little too close. "I said, you think you're better than us?" Kayla turned her head, locking eyes with him for just a moment. Calm, unbothered, she didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than anything she could have said, and it hit him like an insult. The man's jaw tightened, and his friends started closing in behind him. "You gonna ignore me, huh?" "Oh, I get it," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "Too good to talk to people like us, right?" The cashier, an older man who'd seen his fair share of fights in this neighborhood, looked nervous. He glanced at Kayla and then at the men, hands fumbling as he bagged her drink. "Miss, maybe you should—" "I'm good," Kayla interrupted, her voice steady. She placed a 20 on the counter, her calm tone masking the storm she felt brewing. The man wasn't having it. He stepped closer, his shoulder brushing against her arm as he laughed in her face. "Yeah, you're good, huh? Not for long." Kayla exhaled slowly, her mind already calculating escape routes, threat levels, and movements. She could leave now, push past them, and avoid what was clearly about to happen. But something told her they wouldn't stop there. Men like this didn't back down when ignored. They'd follow her outside, maybe surround her car. The second she stepped onto that dark street, things would escalate. So she waited, calm still, her heart steady as stone. "What you scared now?" one of the others jeered. Another chimed in, "Figures. All bark, no bite." They laughed, feeding off each other's bravado. To them, Kayla was just an easy target. Someone to humiliate, to scare, to feel powerful over. What they didn't know, they couldn't know, was who they were actually messing with. Because Kayla wasn't just some woman minding her own business. She was a Navy SEAL. A highly trained operative who had spent years mastering hand-to-hand combat, weapons training, and tactical operations. She'd been deployed in the most dangerous parts of the world. She had faced down threats bigger and meaner than any of these men could ever dream of being. And while she wasn't one to flaunt her skills or pick unnecessary fights, she wasn't about to let them corner her. Still, Kayla gave them one last chance. She turned to the man with the tattoo and said softly, "You don't want to do this." Her voice wasn't pleading. It was a warning. But the men didn't hear it that way. They laughed again, louder this time. "Or what?" The leader sneered, his face just inches from hers now. "You gonna cry?" Kayla looked at him for a long moment and then she smiled. Not a big smile, just enough to show the faintest trace of amusement. Enough to let him know, just for a second, that he had no idea what he just stepped into. "Have it your way," she said quietly. What happened next would be talked about for weeks. Security cameras outside the store would later show flashes of movement, blurs of arms and legs, and the sound of bodies hitting the pavement echoed down the street. A door swung open, and one by one, the three men stumbled out into the cold night air, groaning, clutching their ribs, their pride shattered. Kayla followed them out, her hoodie still perfectly in place, her expression calm as ever. She didn't say a word as they scrambled to their feet, eyes wide with confusion and fear. The leader, his face red with humiliation, pointed a shaking finger at her. "What the hell are you?" he shouted. Kayla stepped forward, just close enough to look him dead in the eye. "I warned you," she said simply. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, her footsteps quiet, her drink still cold in her hand. Behind her, the men watched in stunned silence as she disappeared into the night. They didn't know her name. They didn't know where she came from. But they knew one thing for certain. She wasn't someone you messed with. And they would never forget it. Kayla's footsteps were steady as she walked to her car, the night air cool against her face. The parking lot was nearly empty, the hum of distant traffic the only sound aside from her quiet breathing. She slid into the driver's seat and set the drink in the cup holder. For a moment, she sat still, hands on the steering wheel, staring through the windshield at nothing in particular. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened. She wished she could say it would be the last. People underestimated her all the time, and most days she preferred it that way. She didn't wear her Navy SEAL background like a badge. She didn't need people to know what she was capable of. But every so often, someone pushed too far, and the side of her she tried to keep buried had to surface. She turned on the ignition, the low rumble of the engine filling the silence, and pulled out of the lot. As she merged onto the main road, her mind drifted back to the men outside the store. They didn't look like hardened criminals, more like guys who thought they owned the world because no one had ever told them otherwise. The arrogance, the entitlement, it was always the same. And the look on their faces when they realized they'd picked the wrong person. Kayla had seen it too many times. But tonight felt different. She couldn't put her finger on why. Maybe it was the way the leader had glared at her as she walked away, like he wasn't done. That unsettled her more than she cared to admit. She wasn't scared. Fear wasn't something she carried anymore. But her instincts were nagging at her, and Kayla had learned to trust those instincts. They'd saved her life more than once. As the streetlights flashed past, her thoughts drifted back to where it all started. Kayla hadn't always been this version of herself. She grew up in a small town, the kind of place where neighbors knew your business before you did. Her father was a mechanic, her mother a nurse. They were good people, hard-working, proud. They'd taught her to stand up for herself, to never back down from what was right. But no one could prepare her for the life she chose. Joining the Navy had been her way out, a path to something bigger. She remembered the way people had looked at her when she announced she was going to try for the SEALs. A woman? They'd said, "That's impossible." The odds had been against her. The training had been brutal, physically, mentally, emotionally. There were days she wanted to quit, days when she questioned if she was strong enough, but giving up wasn't in her nature. She pushed harder, fought harder. She proved them all wrong in the end. Kayla became one of the few women ever to earn the Navy SEAL Trident, a symbol of everything she'd sacrificed and achieved. But the toughest part about the SEALs wasn't the training. It was the aftermath. The real world didn't care about her title or what she'd done. All people saw was a woman, someone they thought was weak or easy to push around. It used to bother her. Now she just found it exhausting. Kayla turned onto her street, the houses quiet and dark. She lived in a small, two-bedroom place on the edge of town, a modest home she bought after she left the military. It was nothing fancy, but it was hers. It gave her peace. She parked in the driveway, grabbed her drink, and stepped out of the car. As she approached the front door, a subtle flicker of movement caught her eye. Her head snapped to the side, scanning the shadows. Nothing. She paused, frowning slightly, then shook it off. She was always on edge after encounters like tonight. It was muscle memory, her body instinctively preparing for a threat that wasn't there. Inside, the house was quiet, almost too quiet. Kayla dropped her keys on the table by the door and kicked off her sneakers. She grabbed a glass of water from the kitchen and sat on the couch, letting her body relax for the first time all evening. But her mind didn't stop. It replayed the store, the men, the look on the leader's face. She couldn't shake it. Her phone buzzed on the table, pulling her back to the present. Kayla picked it up and glanced at the screen. It was a message from her old SEAL buddy, Marcus. "You good? Heard you were back in town." Kayla smirked faintly. Marcus had a way of knowing things without being told. They'd served together for years, and even though he was retired now too, he never stopped looking out for her. She typed back, "Yeah, just the usual nonsense. I'm good." His reply came almost immediately. "Stay sharp. You know how it goes." Kayla sighed and put the phone down. Marcus was right. She did know how it went. Trouble didn't always end where you thought it would. Sometimes it followed you home. Hours passed, the quiet of her house settling in around her. Kayla tried to sleep, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw their faces. The sneers, the arrogance, the way their laughter had cut through the silence. The leader's face, especially, that glare. It wasn't just anger. There was something else in it. Something darker. At some point, exhaustion won. She drifted off into a light, restless sleep, her training keeping her ears attuned to every creak and groan of the house. It was a sound at 3 a.m. that woke her, a faint thud from outside. Kayla's eyes snapped open, her body instantly alert. She didn't move at first, just listened. The wind. An animal? Another sound. This time, it was closer. Kayla sat up slowly, her heart rate steady as her mind raced. She slid her feet onto the floor, moving silently as she crossed the room. She pulled back the curtain just enough to peek out. The driveway was empty, the street was dark, but something wasn't right. Her instincts were screaming now, the kind of gut feeling she hadn't had since her deployments. She grabbed her phone and sent a quick text to Marcus. "Something's off. We'll check in soon." Then she moved to the entry table, where she kept a small wooden box. Inside was a simple handgun, a backpack she rarely touched. Kayla didn't like weapons in her home, but old habits died hard. She slid the gun into her waistband and moved toward the back door, her steps silent, her breath controlled. As she reached the kitchen, she heard it again, a faint shuffle just outside. Someone was there. Kayla's jaw tightened, her mind already preparing for the possibilities. She flicked the back porch light on and stepped to the door. Through the glass, the yard looked empty, just darkness and shadows. She waited, listening. And then she saw it. Movement. A figure darting just beyond the edge of the light. Kayla's pulse quickened, but she didn't panic. She'd been through worse. Much worse. Whoever was out there thought they were hunting her, but they didn't realize they'd just made the biggest mistake of their lives. She unlocked the door, her grip steady as she opened it just enough to step out onto the porch. The cold ebbed at her skin, but she didn't notice. Her eyes swept the yard, her ears picking up every sound. "Come on," she whispered to herself. "Let's see what you've got." The yard was silent again. The figure was gone. But Kayla knew they were still there, hiding, watching. Kayla stayed on the porch, the cold air cutting through her hoodie as she scanned the yard. Her breath was steady, her eyes sharp, searching for the flicker of movement she knew she'd seen. Every nerve in her body was alive now, her instincts screaming at her to stay alert. Whoever was out there had taken the time to come to her home, and that wasn't something she could ignore. Minutes passed. Nothing moved. Not the trees, not the shadows. It was as if the figure had melted into the darkness. Kayla knew better than to trust the quiet. Quiet was just another tactic. She'd been on too many missions where silence had been a prelude to chaos. She stepped off the porch, her sneakers barely making a sound against the grass. The yard wasn't big. A few bushes, a weathered fence that separated her property from the woods beyond. She moved slowly, like a predator, her body instinctively lowering into a stance that made her harder to see. She didn't carry the gun in her hand. Not yet. Holding a weapon sent a message, and she wasn't ready to show her cards. The wind picked up, rustling the trees. For a moment, Kayla thought she saw a shadow shift near the edge of the fence, but when she blinked, it was gone. She whispered to herself, almost smiling, "You're patient. I'll give you that." Kayla crouched near a bush, taking cover as her eyes scanned the line of trees. Her mind raced through possibilities. Was it one of the men from the store? Maybe the leader, too proud to let it go. It wouldn't be the first time someone like him came looking for revenge, thinking they could catch her off guard. Or maybe it was worse, someone who knew who she really was. The Navy SEAL life didn't come without enemies. You didn't get through deployments without leaving marks on people who wouldn't forget you. But why now? And why here? Kayla listened carefully, her ears picking up the faintest sounds. An owl in the distance, the creak of a branch, the soft steps of something, or someone, moving slowly. She turned her head toward the noise, her jaw tight. Then the porch light behind her flicked off. She froze. The light had been on when she came outside. Kayla turned her head slowly, her house now shrouded in darkness. Someone had cut it. The realization hit her hard, not just because it meant she wasn't alone, but because it confirmed what she'd suspected. Whoever was here wasn't just watching. They were testing her. Kayla rose to her full height, her movements deliberate now. "You think you're hunting me," she muttered under her breath. "Bad idea." She made her way back to the porch, her steps still silent. Her fingers brushed against her waistband, where the cold metal of the gun reassured her. She pushed the door open slowly, every muscle in her body braced for what might be inside. The house was dark, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound breaking the silence. Kayla's hand hovered near the light switch, and then she stopped herself. She didn't need the light. Light could expose her, and right now she preferred to stay in the shadows. The living room was clear. So was the hallway. She moved toward the kitchen, pausing as she heard the faint creak of a floorboard above her. Someone was in the house. Kayla exhaled slowly, steadying herself. She'd been here before. Different location, different enemy, same feeling. The adrenaline sharpened everything, like the world itself had slowed down. She moved toward the staircase, her steps careful as she began to climb. Her breathing was light, almost non-existent, the way she trained it to be. Halfway out, she heard it again. A slow, deliberate step from the room at the far end of the hallway. Whoever it was, they weren't in a rush. They thought they were in control. Kayla's lip twitched slightly. That was their mistake. When she reached the top of the stairs, she stayed low, her back against the wall. The hallway was dark, but she could see well enough to know the door to her bedroom was open. She always left it shut. Kayla moved forward, her hand steady as she slipped the gun out of her waistband. She didn't point it. Not yet. She paused outside the door listening. The room inside was quiet now, but she could feel it, the presence of someone who shouldn't be there. Kayla tightened her grip on the weapon and stepped inside, moving so quickly and quietly that whoever was waiting didn't have time to react. The room was empty. Kayla frowned, her mind racing as she swept the space. The window was closed, the closet door ajar, but no one was there. She turned back toward the hallway, her gut telling her something was off. That's when she heard it. Another sound, this time from downstairs. They're toying with me, she thought, her teeth clenching. Kayla moved faster this time, no longer trying to hide her presence. She descended the stairs in a few quick strides, her eyes scanning every corner of the living room. "Come on," she said aloud now, her voice calm but firm. "If you wanted me to know you're here, I know. So let's get this over with." Silence. Kayla felt the tension in her chest building. She wasn't scared. Fear had been trained out of her a long time ago, but she was angry. Whoever was doing this didn't realize what kind of fire they were playing with. She turned toward the front door, checking the lock. Still secure. Then she heard it, the faintest sound of footsteps outside the window. Kayla's head snapped in that direction, just in time to see a shadow dart across her yard toward the street. Her heart pounded, not from fear but from the chase. She yanked the front door open, stepping into the cold night once again. The street was empty, but she wasn't fooled. They were nearby, watching her, testing her limits. Kayla stood still for a long moment, her hands at her sides as she let the night air cool her anger. "Cowards," she muttered, her voice low. Whoever they were, they clearly wanted her rattled. They wanted her to know they could get close, that they could invade her space. But they weren't brave enough to face her. She turned and walked back inside, locking the door behind her. Kayla sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a glass of water as she thought it over. Was this about the men from the store? It didn't seem like their style. They were reckless, loud, full of ego. This was something else, something calculated. Her phone buzzed again. It was Marcus. "Everything good? Call me." Kayla picked up the phone and stared at the message. She should call him. He'd know what to do, or at least how to keep her from spiraling. But part of her didn't want to admit that she needed backup. Not yet. Instead, she typed back, "It's nothing. I'll handle it." Marcus' reply was instant. "Doesn't sound like nothing. Be careful." Kayla set the phone down, exhaling slowly. She glanced toward the window, her reflection staring back at her in the glass. Whoever was out there wasn't finished. She could feel it. And neither was she. Kayla barely slept that night. She sat in the armchair in her living room, her back to the wall, facing the front door and the windows. She knew better than to let her guard down. Whoever was testing her, taunting her, was playing a dangerous game, and Kayla wanted to be ready. She wasn't the type to wait for trouble to come knocking again. As the sun started to rise, the faint glow creeping through the blinds, Kayla's mind was sharp, despite the lack of sleep. She sipped a cup of black coffee, her eyes focused on nothing in particular. The events of the last 24 hours replayed over and over in her head. The men at the store, the shadow in her yard, the lights cutting out, and the deliberate footsteps in her house. All that pointed to something bigger, and she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't random. Her phone buzzed on the table, breaking the silence. She glanced at the screen. It was Marcus again. This time, he didn't text. He called. Kayla sighed, answering the call. "I'm fine, Marcus." "You sure? Because you don't sound fine," he replied, his voice rough with concern. "I've known you too long to believe it when you try to play tough." Kayla smirked faintly. "I'm always tough." Yeah, I know. But something's off. I can hear it." Marcus paused. "Whoever's messing with you isn't just messing around. You need backup." "I've only backup," Kayla replied calmly. "Not yet." "Kayla." "Marcus, I'll handle it." The line went quiet for a moment before Marcus muttered, Don't let your pride get you hurt. You know how these things go. Kayla softened, her tone quieter. I know what I'm doing, Marcus, I promise. She hung up before we could argue further, setting the phone down on the table. Marcus was right. She had seen situations like the spiral before. Threats like this started small, but they rarely stayed that way. And she knew firsthand how dangerous people could become when they felt cornered or underestimated. Kayla stood up, running a hand through her hair as she stared out the window. She wasn't going to wait anymore. If they were watching her, she'd draw them out. On her terms. She grabbed her jacket and her keys, tucking her phone into her pocket before stepping outside. The morning air was crisp, the neighborhood waking up around her. The street was quiet, but she could feel eyes on her, the same invisible pressure that had lingered all night. She climbed into her truck, her hands steady on the wheel as she drove toward town. The convenience store was where it had all started. Kayla didn't believe in coincidences. If those men were connected to what was happening, she'd figure it out. And if they weren't, well, she'd still find answers. When she pulled into the parking lot, the store was nearly empty. The only car parked out front was an old, rusted pickup truck. Kayla took a deep breath, stepping out of her vehicle, her boots crunching against the gravel. She pushed the door open and scanned the inside. Behind the counter stood an older man who looked up as the bell chimed. His eyes lingered on Kayla for a second too long before he offered a stiff nod. "Morning," Kayla said, her tone polite but firm. "Morning," the man replied gruffly. Kayla walked the aisles slowly, pretending to browse as she kept her senses sharp. She could feel the man watching her from behind the counter. His gaze wasn't casual, it was wary, like he knew exactly who she was. When she grabbed a bottle of water and approached the register, she finally looked him in the eye. "Quiet morning." He hesitated, then shrugged. "It's early." Kayla placed the bottle on the counter and spoke casually. "Those guys from yesterday, they've been back." The man stiffened just slightly, but it was enough for Kayla to notice. "Don't know what you're talking about." "Sure you do," Kayla replied evenly, her eyes never leaving his. 3 men, real loud, caused a scene. The man's jaw tightened, and he looked away. "Haven't seen them." Kayla leaned closer, her voice calm, but sharper now. "See, I think you have. And I think you know more than you're letting on." The man swallowed hard, his hand twitching slightly on the counter. "Look, lady, I don't want trouble." "Trouble found me first," Kayla said, her voice low. "I'm just trying to figure out why." The man glanced around the empty store, his voice dropping to a whisper. "They're not the type you want to mess with." Kayla raised an eyebrow. "Neither am I." He looked at her carefully, as if weighing whether to say more. Then he muttered, "They've been around, hanging out back behind the old garage. But if you're smart, you'll leave it alone." Kayla nodded, grabbing the water and turning to leave. "Thanks for the advice." She walked outside, her heart beating a little faster now. The old garage wasn't far, a run-down building on the edge of town where people went when they didn't want to be seen. She climbed into her truck, her thoughts racing. If those men were there, she'd get the answers she needed. As she pulled up to the garage, Kayla's instincts flared again. The place looked abandoned, windows shattered, weeds growing up through cracks in the pavement, but she knew better than to trust appearances. She parked her truck a short distance away and got out, moving quietly as she approached on foot. When she reached the side of the building, she heard voices, low and muffled, but unmistakably human. Kayla crouched, peeking through a broken window. Inside, the 3 men from the store were standing in a circle, talking in hushed but urgent tones. She couldn't make out every word, but phrases caught her ear. "She's too dangerous. We should have handled it yesterday. She's not gonna stop." Kayla's blood ran cold. They were talking about her. The leader, the one who'd stood in her face at the store, slammed his fist against a metal barrel, his voice rising. "I don't care who she is. She's just some woman. You hear me?" One of the others muttered something, and the leader snapped back, "I don't want excuses. We finish this tonight." Kayla's jaw tightened, her heart pounding in her ears. They weren't just watching her, they were planning something. The thought sent a surge of adrenaline through her veins, but she didn't move. Not yet. She needed more. Suddenly, one of the men turned toward the window, his eyes narrowing. Kayla ducked low, pressing herself against the wall as she heard footsteps approaching. "Did you get that?" one of them muttered. The leader's voice was sharp. "Go check it out. Now." Kayla's muscles tensed, every instinct telling her to move. She slipped along the edge of the building, staying low and silent as the door creaked open. A pair of boots stepped out onto the gravel, pausing just feet from where she was crouched. Kayla held her breath, her body perfectly still as the man scanned the area. For a moment, it felt like he might see her, but then he grunted and turned back inside. "Nothing," he muttered. The door slammed shut, and Kayla exhaled slowly, her mind racing. This wasn't over. Whatever they were planning, she had to stop it. And next time, they wouldn't see her coming.